Connie Mutel is our speaker tonight. She's written several books about Iowa's natural history and ecological restoration, including The Emerald Horizon, A Watershed Year, A Sugar Creek Chronicle, and Fragile Giants. Before her retirement, she was the senior science writer at the university's IIHR Hydroscience and Engineering Department at the College of Engineering. And in conjunction with our latest changing exhibit, Project Passenger Pigeon, on our lower level, Connie joins us this evening for a talk on climate evolution. We're lucky to have her, and we're very happy she's here. Connie Mutel.
Is this good now?
Yeah. Can everybody hear her?
Good for everybody? So it's almost good if you can introduce the talk on climate change with a few caveats, like it's way too cold out tonight. Thanks for coming out with cold. But two other things, I flipped through a few of these slides, and it looks like somehow the background disappeared on a lot of my slides. And whenever that happens, it doesn't happen too often, but I just say, this is why we've got to handle climate change now, instead of thinking about taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere after the fact, because it just doesn't work. We've got to get ahead of the process. And also my voice, I've been ill lately, so my voice is kind of weak. So if you'll just bear with me, we'll start going. And I'm also very bad at going backwards instead of forwards, but I think we're good. So climate evolution, where we are, how we got here, and where we go from here. I'm not going to talk a lot about climate science tonight. I know that many of you are environmental studies students, is that right, or are taking classes that have to do with the environment. So I think that you probably covered this stuff in your classes. But I'll just go very rapidly through climate change. An increase in global average temperature from greenhouse gas emissions, primarily carbon dioxide, produced mostly by the burning of fossil fuels. So that's a given. I'm not going to talk about is climate change real. We don't have to worry about it. I'm going to assume that we all have this kind of assumption about the process. Here's where the background is good. So, climate change is real. It's based on scientific evidence. Here are some basics, 2 slides of basics, and then we're going to get into other things that are more fun. It's happening now. It's not something in the future. 10 years ago, we thought this was something that was going to happen, maybe starting 50 years from now. But the one big thing that we figured out with our models and with experience is that climate change is happening now. And the biggest thing is that it's coming on us faster than the models that have predicted. It's affecting all weather events and all facets of life, absolutely everything already. The changes are getting larger. It's progressing faster than we predicted. And it's costing more to ignore than to address. So that the costs of getting over climate change are much higher than they would be if we had just used that money to address climate change in the first place. Basics continued, we're now approaching tipping points, the points of no return, and this threatens to redefine our civilization. Sometimes people say, well, humans are going to disappear. I don't know, we can all guess, we can't look into the future. We've never been here as a species before. I don't think that people will disappear, but I think our civilization will be reshaped in a major way. And it's at the point now that this last summer, our mayor here in Iowa City said that we have a climate emergency. This is a term that was adopted by the organization Climate Mobilization, which says the only way we can work with climate change at this point is to have an all-out effort that is like the World War II mobilization that we had in this country. We need something that comes on that fast and that strong if we're going to deal with it. So, those are the basics. This is what I'm going to talk to you today instead. What I'd like to do is give you kind of an historic outline of how we here in Iowa were part of this whole climate change problem. What happened from the time our first Euro-American settlers came here into Iowa? What did they do? What have we done since then? How has agriculture evolved? And tie climate change the agricultural land restoration, and also mention other environmental problems in passing. And then I'm going to talk about, as our introducer said, the passenger pigeon and the exhibit in the basement here, if I was asked to cover this. So we're going to learn a little bit about passenger pigeons. And then we'll talk about the global climate today and in the future and how we can deal with it. So let's start with, I'm going to turn this way so I can, sorry, so I can see the slides a little bit better. So let's look forward, look backward, in other words, to point forward. Let's look at Iowa, what Iowa was 200 years ago, when we had mostly Native Americans here. We had some Euro-American traders that were in Iowa, but there was no formal settlement at that point. And at that point, Iowa in 1800 was a state of prairie, woodlands, and wetlands, totally covered with natural ecosystems. It was a state that was defined by the stability and integrity of its systems. We didn't have rapid changes, things changed. Everything was working together in a system so that changes happened slowly and in a moderated way. And indeed, the entire world had, at that point, we can say, a stable climate. Atmosphere and sea levels had been stable for at least 10,000 years, we know. And why is that figure important? Well, because if you think about it, civilization has only been around for what, maybe 6,000 years, 7,000 years. So if you think about the entire process that we think of as human development, not evolution, but the evolution of our culture and civilization, all of that happened when sea levels were fairly stable and when the climate was stable. And that's why changing the climate so quickly now is such a big deal. So Iowa was a land mostly of tall grasses. About 80% of Iowa was covered by the tall grass prairie. Those grasses had thick soils, deep roots, and slow-moving waters. So the ecosystems at that point were governed by these deep-rooted prairie grasses. Those deep roots caught and controlled the flow of water through the soil and prevented the flow of water over the ground. The water had to sink into the soil. The soils were about half air. They acted like a gigantic sponge soaking up the water. And because of this massive control of water and of soils, the soils really didn't have much of a chance to erode with these deep-rooted grasses. We had no erosion, no soil erosion, no water pollution. We could have at that point drunk the water from any stream in Iowa. And the ecosystems were marvelously flood resistant. The soils also stored carbon. So if you think about when we think about carbon, climate change now, what we think about and want are systems that take that carbon dioxide up in the air, that carbon dioxide that we have too much of at this point, and pull it down and store it in the soil. And that's what the prairies did in spades. It was literally, I think of it as a Garden of Eden, as a place that was sustainable for millions of species over thousands of years. And when I was preparing this talk, I thought a lot about, how did those species have thought about what their lives were like, if indeed plants could think that or not, the animals can, but not plants. But I think that realistically, if you had been able to ask any of the species that were found in Iowa at that time, do you think they're going to disappear? It would have been a joke. There would have been no concept within any given species that the death of that species was even a possibility, because the entire system was governed by complicated interactions that didn't guarantee the survival of every individual, but it did include the survival of the species as a whole. So let's get into passenger pigeons. One of the marvelous species that was in Iowa at that time was the passenger pigeon. This is a species that ranged over the entire eastern part of the United States. The Iowa landscape was on the western edge of the passenger pigeons, both up the eastern half half of Iowa was regularly visited by passenger pigeons, and they flew all the way up into Canada. They were migratory birds. They went south in the winter to the southern United States. In the summer, they came up north, including to Iowa, to breed, to nest, and reproduce. It was the most abundant land bird in North America. 3 to 5, not million, but billion individuals at any given time. And some people say the most abundant land bird in the world. These birds were very highly gregarious. They were a communal species, and so they flew together in a river, what people call rivers of birds, in immense and deafening flocks. These flocks were described, there was one flock of passenger pigeons that flew over this part of Iowa in the past, in the mid-1800s, that was supposed to be 600 million birds in this one flock. The flocks were up to a mile wide, and Audubon described a flock flying over an area, I think it was Ohio, that was a mile wide and that was dense enough to shade the ground for 3 days straight without interruption. There were so many of them. And you could, of course, hear these birds coming from many, many, many miles away. People describe it as a bit frightening. You know, the thing that's kind of, that I'm sad about is that we really don't have a lot of descriptions of passenger pigeons because they disappeared before we even were getting into counting animals. I mean, at best we identified them. But these were very large species, highly communal, as I said. They nested together in areas that might be a few square miles, maybe a little bit bigger. And in that one area, there would be dozens of nests in a single tree. The birds would congregate in trees in such density that there would be so many birds sitting on a single large oak branch, about 6 to 8 inches of diameter, that people recorded that branch breaking off of the tree from the weight of the passenger pigeons. So it was an incredible, amazing species, something that we can barely imagine today. They were eastern North America migratory. And they were birds of savannas and woodlands. They ate the mast from the trees, the nuts, the acorns, the beech nuts, the chestnuts, and the like. And were very important in controlling the ecological processes, in spreading the seeds of those areas and the cycling of nutrients. So they were an integral part of this landscape. So, in the 1830s, people first came to this area. In fact, we have quotes. It's nice to be in Old Capitol because we have quotes of people standing right here, right where Old Capitol is, and looking out over the hills around us and describing the clear Iowa River down below, the copses of hazelnuts off to the south and the east. And they came up here and they decided to settle this place to make this the capital. But for the most part, the people that came to Iowa were people that were hungry. They were hungry for food, they were hungry for land, they were hungry for a place where they could live in peace and in harmony and raise their children safely. That land, that desire meant that they had to break the prairie. I think that's a very interesting verb that's used. It meant that they literally went through the prairie and ripped up the prairie with the John Deere moldboard plow, and also brought in the cattle that grazed in compressed soils. They tiled the landscape to drain it of water. And the settlers cut virtually every single tree in the Iowa landscape. There are very, very few trees that are older than, they would be, that are older than, say, 1850. If you have a tree that's older than that, it's quite unusual. So, in this breaking of the prairie, the settlers redefined Iowa's landscape, ecosystems, and natural processes. And again, remember that a community is not just made out of who lives there, but it's made of these it consists of these intricate processes that make the ecosystem work together. And those ecosystems were ripped apart, those processes were ripped apart at the same time that the prairie roots were ripped up. So, about this time, in this period from the first settlement from 1830 to to about 1900, the passenger pigeons demonstrated a marked decline. The passenger pigeons have always been hunted. They have been hunted by Native Americans before Euro-Americans came to this continent. And they were hunted by the settlers. The settlers killed a lot of passenger pigeons. They would take their shotguns out, like fire the shotgun up into the sky, and you would have several birds with each shot dropped down to the ground, and these birds were taken back to be fed to pigs. They were considered a cheap source of protein. Passenger pigeons were kind of the fast food restaurant of the early and mid-1800s. They were abundant, delicious, and easy to kill. They could be shot. They could be caught in nets. They were so abundant that you could actually just take a stick, and they were very low-flying birds, and wave the stick around in the air and knock passenger pigeons down and kill them, or go in at night and knock them down from trees. But it's interesting. Again, we have very few records from the 1800s about passenger pigeons. But again, I think that the people living here at that time would have thought that it was impossible and unimaginable that this species would ever disappear. That just wasn't a part of the mindset. How could a bird species consisting of billions of birds ever disappear? No way. In the mid-1800s, that concept was broken. I think until about then, the populations of birds continued. Maybe decreased a little bit, but on the whole, they were stable. But in the mid-1800s, you had market hunters coming in, commercial hunters that came in with more modern rifles, and they were aided by railroads. The railroads could take them into a place where there were a lot of passenger pigeons very rapidly. The telegraph aided with that as well. And the people would go into an area and just kill as many as they wanted. Some people would call that greed. A lot of sources that I read called it gluttony. And then they were shipped east by the millions. They were shipped in railroad cars, in barrels. They were shipped alive. They were shipped dead. They were shipped injured. They were shipped off to the restaurants, to St. Louis, to Chicago, to Milwaukee, to all the cities to the east, where they were considered a delicacy. And within a decade, you started to experience massive and rapid declines of the passenger pigeon in the kind of going into the late 1800s. By the late 1800s, only small scattered flocks were still around. The last big flock in Iowa flew across Iowa in the different records again, either the 1850s or 1860s. But by the late 1900s, across this range, there were only small scattered flocks. So, in the 1800s, again, as I said, we replaced prairies and wildlife with imported species. We took off the species that had been here for thousands of years, and we brought in species. We brought in ecosystems from Europe and from the eastern U.S. and transplanted it on the land. And almost immediately, within a few years, you started to see the development of the problems that are our biggest problems in Iowa right now. One, of course, is the loss of biodiversity. That's a big thing, because if you decrease the number of species and you decrease that complexity, you have a decrease in the functioning of the ecosystem. But also soil erosion. You can imagine all of that soil, all of that cornfield has been plowed. You have a lot of exposed soil that would easily erode. You have a lot of erosion from the cattle feedlot up above, and that erosion from the cattle feedlot would wash down into the river and cause water pollution, both sediment and manure. And you had flash flooding. So here you can see, when we had a native ecosystems, you didn't have deeply incised floods, stream beds like this. This stream bed is a creation of human years. So 50 years before that, you would have had a nice, slow-moving swale. And as soon as you start to get big gushes of water coming off the hillside, you have the erosion down, you have these incised stream beds, and those are associated with our flash flooding nowadays. No, we really got a problem. So, there we go. Also, climate change and bushel soil carbon. When you plowed up those deep roots from the prairies, the prairie plant roots, you got the decomposition of those roots, and they release carbon dioxide. As they oxidize, they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So then the prairie, the plowing of the prairie is thought to be associated with a jump in the carbon dioxide, in the global carbon dioxide of the world. So Iowa agriculture 1800s, it looked, you know, for the most part, it was still it was a lot more stable than it is now. And nice farms that were kind of nestled into the landscape, diverse farms. This is about 1900. We had the maximum number of farms, about 230,000 farms. Now we're down to about 80 or 70 or 80,000, I think. But this was Iowa, and this was not the rest of the world, because in the rest of the world, we had the Industrial Revolution starting. It started in the mid-1700s. And this was based on a different energy source. That's the whole crux of the Industrial Revolution, that you switched from muscle power to fossil fuel power. And if you think about that switch, it had to be tremendously liberating to human beings. None of us can blame people for switching to fossil fuels at all, because all of the things that had been done by hand now could be done more easily with machines. In 1900, about 150 years ago, after the Industrial Revolution was starting to play out in Europe and in the eastern United States, we started to see the Industrial Revolution apply to farming. And that consisted of the switch from horses to tractors. And with that switch was fueled in part by the opening of the oil fields in the 1920s, the oil fields both in Texas and in the Persian Gulf. That meant we had a lot of cheap energy, so farmers could afford to buy the fossil fuels. By 1950, tractors had pretty much totally replaced horses on the landscape. No, this is not really good. Okay, the result of this was that the flooding and the soil erosion worsened. The more heavy machines you got on the land, the worse the soil erosion became, the flooding got worse. And agriculture from 1950 on was firmly linked through the use of fossil fuels to climate change. Intimately tied together. What about passenger pigeons in this period? Well, 1901, the last wild passenger pigeon was shot. And at that point, that was the last one, that you would go out in the field and see. But there have been captive populations in zoos, in private reserves, and the like. And the last of those passenger pigeons died in 1914. That bird was Martha. Here, Martha died on September 1st of 1914 in the Cincinnati Public Schools. So we can say that the passenger pigeon went extinct in 1940, but in reality, it had gone extinct at least a quarter of a century before that. By the 1880s, it was what ecologists might call the walking dead. These were animals that were still alive and functioning, but they couldn't reproduce anymore. The populations were too fragmented, too widely spaced. The flocks were too small to do successful reproduction. And the decline and disappearance of that species was inevitable. The interesting thing is that decline and disappearance of this magnificent bird was preventable. If we had had strong legislation, if we had had, for example, bag limits imposed maybe in the 1860s or the 1870s, the people that ornithologists I talked to said that we could still have passenger pigeons around 3 million. And there was indeed some legislation that was passed in the 1850s, and the 1860s, and the 1870s by various states. But that legislation was weak, it wasn't enforced, and it was too little, too late. So the birds went extinct. The good thing, if you can call it a good thing, one thing that the disappearance of the passenger pigeon did was that it convinced people that the impossible and the unimaginable could indeed happen. And because of that, there was a major conservation movement that started around a little bit before 1900. It was based on a lot of organizations, like the Audubon Society came into existence in the late 1800s by education and which I can't remember right now. So 1850 to present, what's happening with agriculture? Industrial processes are increasingly applied to industry. I think that by 1900, we were kind of set up in this country. We were kind of on a beeline for the industrial agriculture that we have now. But we had to go through the development of the technology, get beyond World War II, and then since that time, we have raced into these large-scale intensive farming that we have now. So industrial processes were increasingly applied to farming. Everything got bigger. The fields got bigger, the farms, the machinery. The domination by two annual crops, which everybody in this room knows, I'm sure, corn and soybeans. Animals and to confine the animal feeding operations instead of out in the fields. And along with all of those intensifications, there was a magnification of the problems of runoff, soil erosion, water pollution, and flooding. So those problems started back in the 1830s, and they just got more and more intense. And there was an intensification, increasing dependence on the use of fossil fuels. Fossil fuel energy is now used for everything, for irrigation, for machinery, for drying corn, for seed production. Fossil fuel-based chemicals, nitrogen and phosphorus, fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides all have fossil fuels as their base chemical. Iowa has among the highest use of these fertilizers and chemicals in the nation. Confined livestock, once you put them into these confined livestock operations, concentrate the wastes and lead to the release of a lot of methane, which is very potent. It's actually a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Sorry. And industrial farming, all of this industrial farming also magnifies climate change because it increases the use of fossil fuels and the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Globally, the same thing that was going on, and these graphs are so interesting because it shows you what happened starting around 1950, right after World War II. All of our problems have gotten really a lot bigger since 1950, since the end of World War II. This is the fossil fuel consumption. Look at 1950. We used just a little bit. Sorry, I don't have a laser with you, but we had used just a little bit of the fossil fuel. And since then, it has increased exponentially. And along with that, the carbon dioxide emissions have grown exponentially. And along with that, both global land and ocean temperatures have increased, have gone up tremendously. And lest you think that this isn't our problem because most of the greenhouse gases are being released by China now, which is true. Here is a map of cumulative CO2 emissions. And if you see that our country, the United States, is clearly the country that has released the greatest amount of cumulative carbon dioxide. So when you look up into that atmosphere and think about climate change, you can think that most of that was generated from right here where we are in Iowa and in the United States. So where are we now in about almost 2020? The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is up to 410 parts per million. It's going up about 2 parts per million a year. It's up over 100 parts per million. And if you look at this graph that goes back to 800,000 years ago, this is way deep. People have been here the last 200,000 years, right? So this is 4 times longer than we even have Homo sapiens on the Earth. And that entire period, we never had carbon dioxide higher than 300 parts per million. We're now at 410 parts per million, and we're continuing to go up. Actually, our curve upward is continuing to steepen and increase. Globally, the average temperature rise is about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 1 degree centigrade. Each decade, and this is manifest in many ways, each decade is warmer. The last 5 years have been the hottest on record. And just the last year, I think, has been amazing. June 9, 2019 was the hottest June on record. July 2019 was the hottest month ever on record. And NOAA, our federal agency NOAA, stated clearly that almost entirely, these records are almost entirely due to climate change, not to anything else. Sea level average rise around the globe is 8 inches. It's higher along the Atlantic coast here in the U.S. It's around 12 inches, but average around the globe is about 8 inches. And I want you to look a little bit at that graph there. You can see that the temperature and the global release of carbon dioxide are follow each other very well. So what about Iowa? What's happening in Iowa in the last 30 years? Temperatures are up a little bit less than the global average. We think it's about 1 degree Fahrenheit, half a degree centigrade. You can see the curve there. Hotter air means wetter air because hotter air can hold more moisture. So the absolute humidity has been increasing 2 to 4% per decade. And this is what's amazing to me. Wetter means more precipitation. In the last 3 decades, we've had our average annual precipitation in Iowa increasing 2 inches a decade. So in the last 3 decades, the last 30 years, we've gone from an average annual precipitation of 32 inches to 38 inches. And this last year, mid-2018 to mid-2019, nationally, we had the wettest 12 months on record. Iowa had a record precipitation, never before this high, as far as we know with our records, of 51 inches. If you think we've had a lot of rain in the last year, we've had almost 50% more than the average. Hotter air also means more energy. You know that heat is energy. So if we have more energy in the atmosphere, we have more extreme weather events, and indeed, you can see that in the Midwest, we have documentation of increased moisture coming down in very heavy